and our responses, particularly in the light of freshwater and carbon. And that's fantastic and essential, of course, but it's very easy to lose sight of a couple of things. One is that people need to be able to farm profitably, they need to be able to farm productively, and they need to be able to fit farm systems to the land and the climate and the people in a way that provides the best outcomes. And that is, and this is where I'm heading, that is a complex jigsaw puzzle. Right? It's not easy to kind of say how do we fit a farm system best to the land and everything else that goes around that. And it's very easy in today's world of sort of 20-second sound bites to look for what's the silver bullet. Oh, we just feed our cattle seaweed and we'll be right, or whatever else it might be. And we know that farm systems are complex, they have feedback loops, it's not that simple. And today we have some people in the room who have some fantastic experience and some learnings from working through farm systems in both a research and a practical way. So we're very excited to hear from those people. I'm going to invite Graham Ogle to come up now, and Graham's going to jump up and down during the day introducing people. I guess Graham has done a lot of work in recent weeks working with many of you, organising today, and on behalf of Rezare Systems, we're very grateful for that work as well. Thanks, Graham.
Thank you, Andrew. Rezare's been planning to run this workshop for quite some time, and it's a real pleasure to have a room full of all the people we want here for this workshop. What I want to do is just cover why we're running the workshop and a little bit about how. I think this is a chance for... Rezare's been looking for the chance to have a bit of a, and I found the word the other day, a policy refresh, a strategy refresh, sorry. Very cool word. And we thought, what better way is there to have a strategy refresh than invite all the right people, and we think you're all the right people, to a venue and talk about what we see as really valuable to farmers. What is value? What is value when we say, of all the things we can provide a farmer, what are the valuable things? I guess I started my career, my idea of that really was forged out of when I started my career in the 1980s, which meant that I had 2 decades of excruciatingly low product prices to work with for farmers. I remember sitting with a farmer one day, he was in trouble, the farm was going to get sold up, and I thought, if we get $35 a lamb, you'd be right. And of course, the markets weren't delivering that. Now, you can adjust that by whatever you like, whatever inflation index you like. The CPI would mean that farmers today would be getting $55 a lamb. And I imagine our budgeting would be even more difficult today given the increase in costs. Dairy farmers were getting $2.40 a kilo of milk solids. I mean, it's almost unheard of. And if we ramp that up by the CPI, we'd be talking about a payout today of $3.70. So this was a sort of the anvil that forged my early career, and going out to do things for farmers that were of value. The biggest value we could do for farmers then was increase their profitability, and that started to address all the other problems that were on the farm. So when Rezare set out, as we did in 2004, as a group dedicated to agricultural software development, often we sit around and think, is our strategy aligned with where the value is in the industry? Are we aligning our investment in resources where the value resides in the industry? So what we're going to do today is we're going to think, how might we align our investment with what top farmers are saying is important to them? And I can't think of any better way to start this workshop than listening to some top farmers. So that's what we're doing. I think consulting is also an extension of farming, and we'll listen to consultants after that. The farmers that we'll listen to have been through some process of change or intensive planning. And it's from those discussions that we hope you'll pick up some things about what they value. And maybe a successful outcome of this workshop is if you go home and think, hey, maybe we need a strategy refresh as well. Now I have pleasure in introducing Professor Derrick Moot from Lincoln University. I've worked with Derrick for many years. We first crossed paths when we were working together on the Avery's farm in the Starborough Flaxbourne project. And I realised that this guy had a lot of really relevant stuff in his head for farmers. And I think that year you were nominated Rural Communicator of the Year. Maybe. Yes, you were. And that's because he's a really good rural communicator. And I have great pleasure in introducing Derrick. Thank you, Derrick.
Thanks, Graham.
Sorry, you talk.
Go for it. I didn't win, by the way, so I can't be that good.
Oh, you did?
Can't have.
I shouldn't raise it.
So I actually have a really the job of integrating what we've just heard about SMAP and the Virtual Climate Network. And I'm going to outline a program that I've got funded by Beef and Lamb New Zealand and some commercial sponsors in MB, which is running till the end of next year. And within that program, we're really looking at, and the idea was regenerating hill country. Now, we set this up about 4 years ago before regenerating had a different name, but that's really what we're trying to do. My hypothesis is that there's actually billions of dollars to be made behind the farm gate, and that we've got constraints that are technical, social and environmental. We need to understand what's limiting production and then pick the low-hanging fruit. If we want to move that middle group that we heard about up, then we actually need to pick the models that we know already exist, and we've already had some demonstrations of those out there today. So we've also got to look at the fact that we do have farmers who are really happy sitting in front of their computer, and I know some that actually spend hours doing it, and others that don't want to go anywhere near it. So we've got to understand there's different learning and engagement required. The pathway to change is therefore not straightforward, and if I've learned anything over 25 years, it's that that is not a straightforward thing. You might have the best idea, but it doesn't always work. We've got 3 strong systems to work off in our pastoral industries. We've got a lucerne system, subclover system, and the red clover plantain system that's come out of Massey. So our project was really looking about right plant, right place. Whenever I talk, I always put this up to try and get people to understand where people fit within a continuum of getting information out to farmers. For me, who's a scientist who trains PhD students, I need them to do really good data collection, and it's got high data integrity and really very good. We can publish in peer-reviewed papers. But in terms of currency and relevance for farmers, it's pretty low. And then we move down the models and simulations, and if you talk to a farmer and say, in my model, all of a sudden the eyes glaze over. So we then have to end up doing on-farm trials or on-farm demonstrations. But the most engaging for most farmers is case studies. Somebody did this and this worked. So I find this, it was when I was trying to work out where do I fit in the continuum that I went, this is actually, I operate all the way along it pretty much. And so that's my summary of how we need to get information across. It's got to be good data that we can then get down and develop case studies that operate with. So I came back from the UK about 25 years ago, and I was working on climate change in the UK, and I went, what's going to happen to New Zealand? And I set up a very simple experiment. What happens when you start irrigating the Canterbury Plains? So this is a block of land that we looked at, and one lot we added water to, another lot we added nitrogen to, and the last lot we added water and nitrogen. And the results of really what's driven my last 20 years of research. So that's the normal pasture production curve that you might get out of a Canterbury Plain dryland system, and that would look typical for a lot of east coast of New Zealand. If you just add water, so you've spent 40 grand on your centre pivot irrigator, you produce about 10 tonnes. But the other thing that's interesting about that is that represents the yield production for most of our summer safe, what we would consider summer safe hill country. It's about 10 tonne of dry matter that they produce. And if you look in the spring there's no point in having irrigation in the spring because we generally have a full bucket of water anyway. So it doesn't change much. What happens if you just add nitrogen? We go from 6 to 16 tonnes of dry matter. Just adding nitrogen, not adding water. Look what happened in the spring. This is the underlying principle that John was talking about earlier. He got his legumes growing in the spring and actually he's producing more feed. Because we generally compare a legume with ryegrass and white clover, but on his hill country it's not ryegrass and white clover. It's brown top or Danthonia or sweet vernal that doesn't grow in the spring. So that was the data that really got me interested in, well, can we move farmers forward? And that's what happened on the Canterbury Plains. People added nitrogen. And that's where your 22 tonnes of dry matter comes from, or about 16 or 17 tonnes harvested. So coming back to, it makes the point that nitrogen grows pasture. We know that. But in our hill country, it's generally rain-fed. We need nitrogen to make plants grow. We need to meet lactation demand, minimise impact on air, soil and water, be productive, profitable, socially sustainable, socially acceptable. And therefore, the only way I could see us doing that is by having legume-dominant farms, and either patches of or legume dominant. Essentially, all legumes fix about 30 kilos of nitrogen from the atmosphere for every tonne of dry matter that they grow. So the more legume you grow, the more nitrogen you fix for nothing out of the atmosphere. The other thing to note is I was working with East Coast farmers like Fraser, or Doug in that case. He's got to get an animal from 5 to 35 kgs in 100 days. To make the maths easy, that's 300 grams per head per day. Now, you've heard they're already doing about 400 grams per head per day. But that's the equation. This is simple equations that you have to be able to meet. To do that, you need good quality feed. It has to have an ME of 12. You can't do it on brown top. You've got to have high quality feed. So the only feeds that'll give us 12 megajoules and 300 grams are mostly clover, good quality lucerne or mother's milk. The other thing about that, to answer one of Warren's questions environmentally, is that if we grow animals quickly, because they're eating a good quality diet, they also won't stay on the farm very long. So environmentally, we'll cut their head off, and their methane production is now stopped. So from a practical, pragmatic perspective, at the moment, before we get a whole lot of stuff to inject into their rumen, I can actually reduce the footprint of the sheep and beef sector, and we've done it. And that's why you saw the numbers earlier saying the productivity gains have happened, and that's why our methane production in this sector has dropped by 30% since 1990. We're doing a better job of growing animals. So what information is needed to get more people to adopt this stuff? Well, we've got management packages, all sorts of things available to them, and we've also got a wonderful S-maps to tell us about the soils that we've got that we're working on. And we can get the climate data because we've just heard about it. What we struggle with from the climate data is that virtual climate network doesn't cope with the topography at the moment. So how do you deal with a north and south facing slope? That information isn't there, but it could be. And we need to know a bit more about the biology. So I went looking for the sort of pasture data I might need to try and encourage other farmers to do this sort of transformational change. Because we want to feed into how much pasture can you grow on farm. When people were asking me about their farm systems, they were often saying, well, how much will your pasture grow in my environment? So we looked at old data and said, well, this is what was developed and is in FarmX. Pretty much it's the bars data from Radcliffe and bars data from the 80s. We looked at our lucerne data and said, well, we need a different equation because most of the data that we collected in the 80s was nitrogen deficient. Our legume is not nitrogen deficient, so we actually need a series of equations for different pasture species, such as the lucerne, and with some help from Ravensdown, we got off and developed a potential growth rate for lucerne in an increasing photoperiod and in a decreasing photoperiod. And then we couple that with data from SMAP, and we put it in a model called APSIM, and we work with Plant and Food, and we can actually start mapping what we think the yield might be for the whole of the country for that particular pasture. Now that's at that scale level, and we're working with Landcare to do the same thing for subclover and the management periods and times when we might need to do certain things for subclover. But the real limitation to us doing this was actually there isn't a central repository of pasture data or cropping data. So a spin-off from the Hill Country Futures program is we've started to develop the Agricultural Yields Database with some funding from TRL at Trust. And Rezare's put that together for us. It's about to go live as soon as we get through the last bit of testing. The idea is that all published and unpublished data can end up in this database. You basically put your data in, and it really is just a database. It's not trying to do anything more than be a repository of growth rate data and pasture data for different parts of the country. Because one of the first questions that a consultant will get asked is, but how much will that grow in my environment? And so we need to get that data into one place. The power of that data is this sort of thing here, where we've got some lucerne versus some unimproved pastures on the on Banks Peninsula. There's the unimproved pasture. That's the lucerne data. So the numbers we're talking about, the tripling that John was talking about, is actually happening. It's there and we're seeing it on farm. We took some Pukawa data from Paul Muir for 20 years of pasture growth rates and developed some simple equations and said, well, you grow most of your feed in the spring, but you know what? You actually grow about 17 kilograms of dry matter per millimetre of water. And if we take the virtual climate data and the SMAP soil, plant available soil water data, and we say on the 1st of October, you've got a deficit of about 50 millimetres, which is the average. Your plant available is 124. You're going to, if you get 50 mils of rainfall during October, you're going to grow about 2,000 kilos of dry matter. So those sorts of equations could very quickly become a little app on a cell phone for somebody to start to predict how much pasture they might be producing in the next month, and they can feed it in with their own record of rainfall. So that's where we're trying to head and what we're trying to achieve. So the aim really of the work is to try and expand the forage forecasts beyond perennial ryegrass. There's a lot of other tools in our toolbox out there that farmers are a little bit reluctant to use because they haven't got the data. But we require high quality data and lots of it. We need to validate it with experiments. We need to document some of the success to make our communities confident to engage and invest in their future. So that's where we're at with the AgYields Database. Hopefully it'll be launched at the Grasslands Association meeting in October, and it'll be available for anyone to put data in that they want to. It needs more development. It hasn't got any funding to do that at the moment, so my plea also is there's no resource, but at least we've started. Thank you.
So I guess, stand in front of the microphone, just a few reflections on the day, and I'll keep this brief. So the first thing I thought about was the messages from our practitioners in the morning sessions. So the people, the farmers and the people who are working closely with farmers. And they talked about, unashamedly stolen from your slides, folks, people, planet, performance, and I've just kind of expanded those out a bit more. We talked about the importance of people, and I think we've reflected on that during the day. There were questions about what's stopping data interoperability, and the answer was people. There were questions about how do we get adoption. We talked about the need for specialists, and so a lot of it comes back to the importance of people in our thinking. Mathematical equations are great, but people are very important. Planet, we've talked about the need to make sure that we're farming within the constraints that we've got and doing the right things for our land and our planet. Performance, and I've added, and productivity there, and you know, Martin's questions are good ones. We want to include, we know we often fall into talking about improving production, right? And we know we don't want to talk about improving production, we want to talk about improving productivity. The measure of what we're getting out, and the bottom line measure of that is profit, as long as the other factors are equal for the amount of inputs put in and for the amount of emissions going out. Then something that I got out of those farmers who talked this morning is their strong emphasis on planning, on the processes that they and their teams follow, the communication of those processes, and the precision with which they go and measure. They identify what are the important things for them to measure in their systems, and they go and measure them. And together that, that was talked about as systematisation, turning things into a system that's repeatable, and I think that's key. So some great learnings for me in those areas today. We talked, for those who are involved in research and in governance, we talked about capabilities, and I guess my reflection thinking about some of the presentations was the amount of amazing capability that we've had leveraged in this sector over many years in our science R&D and all of the things that underpin that. Some fantastic capability, and I think that goes to the heart of what you were talking about before, Graham. Other countries are investing in their core competencies, and in New Zealand we've made a lot of investment, not enough, but a lot of investment in building capability in pastoral agriculture and its underpinnings, which has been fantastic. There's some really valuable collections. We talked about the virtual climate stations, we talked about S-maps, and we've talked about some of the other collections that are out there. I didn't want to just say databases because there's a lot more than just databases. Almost every speaker talked about the opportunity to collaborate further, to engage further, to use data from other sources, whether that's climate stations or soils data or any of the other data sets that are potential to use, and the opportunity to engage together. And we see that in some of the collaborative projects that have been done. We talked a little bit about data integration, and to me there's some real benefits in being able to link data and to have common identifiers and all of those necessary things that make it easier to connect the dots between systems, and also consistency in meaning and interpretation, and are we talking about the same things? And then this afternoon we talked about our, and I'm playing some fun games here, but we talked a little bit about sensing. We started off by talking from space, which is very much built on sensing technologies. But I thought, particularly when I was listening to Dean as well, that's another great example of sourcing data so that farmers aren't having to go and measure it. Imagine if you as a farmer, and farmers did have to do this, some still do, go and attend every sale yard that they can so that they know what the prices are. Try and keep their own little book so that they know, where prices are heading. But there are tools that can deliver that data just as space can deliver pasture cover data. And I think we saw through the work that Ravensdown and Balance are doing a bunch of other sensing and use of predictive tools to take some of the effort that farmers would have out of sort of capturing data and making sense of it. A lot of the tools we looked at, including FarmMax and including the tools that Ravensdown and Balance have been working on, have been around making predictions that help people make either recommendations or decisions, and that's really powerful. And I think there's been a thread of discussion going through around, well, how do we then extend those services out? If you've got other crops you want to measure with space, how do you do that? Can we extend those services? If you've got some data that's in FarmMax or one of these other tools, how do we make it available? How do we make data flow into FarmMax? I think my other observation is that we're still at the stage where many of these tools, maybe space being an exception here, require the assistance of somebody, a specialist, to help interpret them, right? Whether that's a rep or an agri-manager in a fertiliser company, and we know there's good reasons why we should be doing that, or a consultant to help you with FarmMax. And I'm not saying, we know those roles are essential and important, but if we're to move to support for adoption and use, we need to think about how we kind of leverage the time of those people. right? So that they're doing the things that only they can do, and that our tools and our systems are easier to use so that specialists don't have to get involved at every step in the way. So I guess that's my kind of reflections on what we've talked about today. I hope that, like me, this has been of interest to you, that you've had your eyes opened to some interesting things that people have been doing and some opportunities. I think it's been great to have the input from the farmers and the practitioners to kind of ground truth what the problems are that we're trying to solve. And what we're hoping is that this conversation continues on. So if you're on Zoom or if you're here in the room, hopefully you've made some contacts or you've made some notes of people you should talk to, and we'd really encourage you to continue to do that. If there's any way that Rezare can facilitate those discussions for you, we're happy to do that as well. So thank you very much.